Somebody, as I came into stream, somebody said, Papa Gut, can you watch the newest Steven Crowder video? So I clicked on Steven Crowder, and this is what I see. I see like, oh, there's two genders. Oh, women shouldn't be in combat roles. Women this. Seems to be pretty typical. I guess we're bored, and then we just keep, dunking on LGBTQ and women and stuff. But anyway, we got this video here. There's our only two genders, third edition. Obviously, I personally think that there's at least 2.5 gender. Just like the famous show Popular 2.5 Men, and no women. That's why I like that show. No, yeah, listen, man, it's more of a philosophy kind of a thing. Biologically, sex-wise, there's two sexes, right? We know that. I guess if you want to be technical, you can include like intersex, but we don't really do that. When it comes to gender's a little bit different. Personally, I'm a dude, whatever. There's a third option for non-binary for people who basically feel like maybe in between in some capacity. I'm chill with that. I understand. I don't fully get it, but I get it, especially for people with gender dysphoria, and I respect it, and that's pretty much where I come from, so.
But you're a classical liberal in that sense, because even though we disagree, you can sit down, express your point of view, and some people on the left view that in and of itself as adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
And I would argue adding fuel to the fire.
That is actually true. It can be a little crazy. Then again, Crowder's a little bit of a sussy baka, Crowder's a little crazy. I can see why people wouldn't want to sit down with Crowder. I would sit down with Den Shapiro, though. I mean, I would sit down with Crowder, too. I don't really care, It's all content, am I right?
Simply trying to eliminate voices from the conversation. By the way,
that or just being completely polarizing and just being
true.
Like, you suck.
Right, yeah.
When where I used to work, they'd call me polarizing because they said I lived in the North Pole because I was, they call me Papa Noel. Santa Claus for short. It's not really shorter, it's just a different language.
Time for this holiday installment of Change My Mind, where we rationalize our positions on seemingly controversial topics. Now, today's subject is an oldie, but I would argue a goodie, in There Are Only Two Genders. Now, I should note I first covered this topic on Change My Mind.
She's thick. Sorry. Women should... Oh, okay. That must have been the one from the day before.
All the way back in 2017. But the discussion...
Is that Curtis Connor? Oh, my God. I can't believe he did a collaboration.
...around gender in the United States and globally certainly has undergone a major transition. No pun kind of intended. We went from the argument back then of gender being socially constructed and existing outside of a binary to now arguing that there are limitless genders and biological...
Is that a cat person? I can't even say a cat girl or cat boy anymore because I'll be canceled, bro. It's crazy.
...terms for sex being used interchangeably with those of gender. There are limitless genders and biological terms for sex being used interchangeably.
Well, I mean, like, I think non-binary has, for the most part, always been like a... Ooh, there's a boss. Has, for the most part, always been... like a blanket term for all the in-between genders in some capacity. But I think that really just three, Got male, female, something in between. Because you can't. I don't think you could be no gender. I mean, like, you're a person, right? Although I guess it's philosophical. I don't know. I guess part of me just who the fuck cares, right? For the most part, I can fundamentally get in line with the whole idea of like body versus mind, because these are two different things, right? It's I think as human beings, that's what makes us human, is having such like an intricate mind, critical thought, all that jazz. So I can understand having like a body gender and a brain gender. Does that make sense? My body gender is obviously being a male, and then my brain gender is being a male as well, because I don't have a mental disorder. I'm just kidding. It's a joke. It's a joke. I have mental disorders, so I can't even make that joke. So yeah.
Interchangeably with those of gender.
She is now the first female and openly transgender four-star officer with the U.S. Public.
Okay, well, technically she's not female, because female, that's biological. I'm just saying, dude. I'm not trying to be rude. Oh, okay.
Health Service commissioned Corps.
A transgender female inmate has been moved to a men's prison after impregnating two other biological female inmates.
Oh shit! You know what's one of the difficult things about putting trans women in women's prisons? It's that it's a similar thing with sports, I guess, but like you can't really regulate. Like, there's no, like, oh, how much medication do you have to take? How many hormones do you have to take in order to be considered a, you know what I mean? And so, like, I don't think you can force an inmate, because they still have rights, obviously, to take, like, a particular amount of hormones or drugs. So it gets into, like, a weird spot where it's like, you know, if let's say you're a trans woman, but like you're not getting your medical treatment, or they're not like, giving it to you, that's also a problem as well. And then you to an extent start to detransition like that, you know, that gets all crazy. It's probably better off for prisons to just kind of have individual areas for trans people, you know, just for their protection. You know, a trans woman in a male prison is going to be somebody that could get beat up, frankly, and could end up being the target of sexual abuse. And a trans woman in a female prison might end up being somebody who's physically stronger and more capable, you know. Although overall, this just gets into a conversation about fucking prison reform, because how toxic and dangerous some of these prison areas can be, I think partially has to do with the way that we orchestrate the prison system. I had a friend who used to be a correctional officer in New York, Rikers Island. Horrible. You know, one of the things he told me that was like, wow. He told me that they don't have air conditioning for most of the staff, but the prisoners. And it's like, you know, you got these 90, 100-degree hot days in New York. Like, I just feel like if you treated them a little bit more like human beings, maybe they wouldn't be so violent in prison. I understand, like, violent criminals is one thing, but a lot of people in you know, I don't know. Yeah, I just feel like there's probably an issue there as well. But that's a whole conversation about prison reform.
After studying Leah Thomas's times from male to female, he says statistically she is an outlier.
So why the drastic change in record time? And how exactly did the students at Texas Women's University rationalize it? Well, meet Gabriella, who may just have provided my favorite conversation in all of Change My Mind history. See if you can find out why. Steven, nice to meet you.
My name's Gabriella. Nice to meet you.
Gabriella, nice to meet you. Oh, thank you very much. You know what? That's actually an incredible compliment, and I'll tell you why. Because I didn't realize until very recently that everyone's feet didn't hurt their whole life.
Oh, yeah, mine too.
Extra wide feet. And then I finally found a company that said, oh yeah, you just have wide feet. You need to buy wide shoes. And these are the only shoes that I have now, because they're the ones I can find. So I'm...
You didn't know that? Yeah, I wear I wear 14 4Es, right? So they're very wide shoes. Or I'll wear like 15 wides. They look a little silly if I wear a 15 wide, but like that's fine as well, you know.
Glad that they're okay.
Yes, sir.
So, Gabriella, thank you for taking the time sitting down. Sorry, I have a little bit of dry mouth. I've been talking for a while. I don't know how familiar you are, if at all, with the kind of change my mind concept, but
yes,
so,
I've seen some of your videos.
Okay, so it's an opportunity to sit down and hopefully rationalize our positions on the seemingly controversial.
You know, I will say is that like one thing that I think that people should understand is, and I feel like conservatives are better at this than progressives, is just sitting down to have the conversation in a polite way, even if you don't look great after the conversation, will make you will actually be profoundly positive for you. Like if you're a progressive and you have a conversation with like Steven Crowder, even if you like, maybe he makes you look wrong or silly or something, if you're just respectful, people are going to be like, you know what, I like this person. And then they'll be more open to like listening to you. One of the reasons I think that like, you know, one of the benefits I had, you know, when I was on TikTok is I was like somebody who was always progressive, but I was more of like a conservative, like I always like appeal, I guess, more to conservatives in some senses because I was just like a regular dude from the real world, you know. It's something to consider, you know. Because sometimes people will just treat people better when they like somebody. I know it sounds so stupid. What if they're like, oh, yeah, I'm a conservative. I don't really like progressives. But I liked this guy. He was actually really nice. All of a sudden, they treat you more human. And they're like, you know what? Let's say this person's trans. Like, I don't want to be mean to trans people because I don't want to be mean to this person that I like. This trans person I enjoy. You know?
Topics. This is one that to me is interesting because I'm revisiting it. I did it years ago. And back then, flies around. Back then, it's interesting some of the arguments that were presented because we've sort of blown past them today. The idea that sex and gender are different, separate. Well, we kind of don't subscribe to that anymore today. Everyone back then, when I would say, hey, I'm concerned about us going on the path here and children transitioning, they would say, that's absurd, that's a logical fallacy.
Will you repeat that again? I'm sorry, I wear hearing aids.
Oh, I apologize. Do you mind moving in and I'll move into you? I just didn't, I didn't want to, as long as you're okay with it, I'll make sure to speak into it. I didn't want to get up in your personal space.
No, it's okay.
But for example, I used to discuss concerns, bring up concerns of children transitioning. Back then, they would say, well, that's absurd, that's a logical fallacy. And of course, here we are where it's law in several states. So that's the reason I thought it would be interesting to revisit it, considering how we've accelerated at light speed. And I still maintain that
it's certainly like it's certainly a very uncomfortable and even scary topic for kids transitioning. I feel like though, when you're having a conversation about trans people, the best way to start, I think, is always going to be you can't really start with kids. You know what I mean? Like sometimes I feel like conservatives will bring up kids when in a trans argument as a way to not actually have the conversation. We'll be like, okay, let's start with like grown adults, trans people, which is where like I think we should naturally start. It's very apprehensive about kids transitioning, and they'll be like, well, what if the kids? It's like, okay, but like let's get there secondly, you know.
There are two genders, and if you disagree with me, I'd be more than happy to hear your point of view, and you can try and change my mind.
Okay. So you, and what is your stance on this again?
That there are two genders.
Okay. I personally disagree, and I know many people that, of course, do agree with this. And again, I very much disagree because I view sex and gender as two things, and typically.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's like we said before. It's like the gender is the sex of the brain, huh? And getting good brain is a very important part of a healthy relationship. My understanding, though, is that the kids say that getting a good brain is just getting good head. That's what we used to call it. Getting good dome, getting good brain. You guys are fucking crazy. Stick with a word, you know?
Whenever you hear about biological sex, typically it's male or female. Of course, you
True,
have people
or
who are
dragon.
intersex and stuff like that. And I do view gender and sex as two different things. And
what I will say, I know I'm talking a lot, but you can suck it up, is that, you know, we have intersex, right? And so intersex is like a biological, we'll say incongruence, right? It's like, it's a little abnormality where you have a mixture between like male and female genitalia in some capacity. I think it's like male, female, pseudo male intersex, pseudo female intersex, and then intersex, something like that. But if there's a body intersex, why wouldn't there be like a brain intersex, right? Like if your body has the incongruence to you know, basically create a situation where, you know, you have some kind of a body mixture between male and female genitalia. What's to say that the brain can't have its own individual intersexness to it? You know what I mean? Where like maybe you were born in a way where the chemicals weren't aligning, you know, or they were aligning differently, and you have some kind of like incongruence in your brain rather than in your body that expresses itself. And then we just basically call that like gender dysphoria to some extent. You know, you understand what I'm saying? You guys get it. You guys get
definitely do view gender as a spectrum.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
On what do you base that? Why do you believe that gender is different from sex? Where did you start believing
the
that?
definition of sex is that it is biological.
It's pretty cool.
So that means chromosomes, hormones.
Primary, secondary, sexual.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
And gender is very much I don't want to say psychological thing.
Yeah, I would say
that's
it
not
is.
really correct. But gender.
Why isn't that correct? I would like to flush their perspective on that out. But like I would say, like to an extent, psychological or brain thing, you know?
It's
I know what
very
you mean.
much, yes, it's very much an identity. That's why typically the term gender and gender identity are grouped together.
Sure.
And so that's how I personally see that.
So what's interesting to me, actually, sorry, I'll lean in. What's interesting to me is
Kiss.
what you're saying is actually what the kinds of arguments that were presented to me years ago, right? That gender and sex are different, but that's not what's even being taught today. So, for example, you have this administration, Joe Biden, referring to Rachel Levine not as our first woman 4-star admiral, but first female. And now, when you look on government forms, if you're transgender, you will check the female box depending on the form. So we are using.
Okay, so two things. First and foremost, because I said something about this before about like, you know, technically a trans person isn't female. I think that in the public perspective, so when he says that this isn't taught, he's not being entirely accurate, in my opinion. When we say, when you say like, oh, this is our first female, you know, admiral, they're trans. I think a lot of people use the term female interchangeably with woman, and not in like the official biological sense of the word female. Because like female technically means like a biological woman. Excuse me, I have a little bit of agita. I don't think that people are actively thinking of it like that. They're not going like, okay, let's call him a female, because I think they're just using the term female incorrectly and interchangeably with like a woman or a girl. Same thing when it comes to like a government ID, I believe, or some kind of government perspective. When you change your, you know, your sex technically on your license as a trans person, you get legally altered. That's really just adhering to an archaic system where we would display our sex onto like your driver's license. Whereas like you probably just display your gender, you could just change it. It's not necessarily that we're being taught these things; they're not different teachings. It's more that like our historically, you know, on a driver's license, you use your fucking male or female. We use sex because there was no other distinction. Now with trans people being able to get legally sex changed. Sorry for the improper terminology, which I agree with being able to do, especially if they've like pretty much fully transitioned. Like we haven't like governmentally been like, okay, let's call gender now. You know what I mean? And we're just like, okay, we're kind of using the archaic system of it, you know?
using them fundamentally interchangeably. And I would say the reason for that is because it was only up until very recently that sex and gender were used interchangeably. The idea that they are separate is a very modern theory. I would argue it's not rooted in reality. It started with postmodern feminism, well, started with French existentialism and then through postmodern feminism. And now we end up at the point where no one can agree on how many genders there are or what we should do with children who are transgender because we've decided to tear down an institution but have
Beat them up. I'm just kidding. Don't do that.
replaced it with nothing.
So, okay. Sorry, I'm trying to. It's very hard to.
Bro, for me, what got me to like understand, not even understand, because I don't think I'll ever understand trans people like fully. I'm fucking cisgendered, you know. I'm vibing, bro. Like I've never had a struggle with my gender, and you know, God, thank God. You know, not to be rude, you know, but who, you know, that's a struggle I certainly don't want. For me, like it all started with like understanding or trying to understand people with gender dysphoria, people having so much distress associated with their gender not matching their sex that they, you know, had higher chances of like suicidality and whatnot. And it came to a point where like it was a diagnosable like mental disorder. And just to be explicitly clear, I don't say mental disorder in a way to be invalidating. I know some people will be like, oh, well, it's just a mental disorder. It's not that. People have different issues in life that we classify as disorders so that they can get the help that they need to be able to function in society. And that's what I look at. And it makes a lot of people happy and function in society and not being so depressive that they can't function. And that's really where it starts for me with that level of empathy. I think that there's got to be something in the brain. Maybe part of it is an environmental factor as well. But mostly in the brain that, like, you know, causes somebody to be, you know, feel like or be born incorrectly or, you know, develop differently, you know, some kind of, could be like hormone washing, could be something in the brain from the being born. Maybe there's even a little bit of a social element there, you know what I mean? But at the end of the day, I mean, I think that these people are valid. You know what I mean?
Please let me know if you don't hear. You need me to repeat myself. I understand.
Yes, sir. Would you mind repeating that?
Yeah, I was just saying that. Yes.
Also turn these up. That might be nice.
Do you I just don't know if it's going to interfere with the microphone. So let me know if you need me to repeat.
As long as it doesn't touch my hearing aid, because if it does, it'll be very loud microphone.
Oh no, and I appreciate you understanding that I need to get close and not being uncomfortable. And I apologize for my breath because I've been talking.
I like that most of this is just like a really awkward, like intimate thing where they're getting closer and closer to each other.
Talking for 3 hours,
No,
so it's probably
I completely understand.
probably smells like a turtle cage. No, what I was saying is the idea that gender and
You think that he would have perfected this though after how many years of doing it, so we wouldn't have these weird interactions?
sex are separate is very new, and it's not used consistently anymore because you now have men and women checking, for example, transgender male to females, checking female boxes, not woman boxes on government forms. You have the former president of the United States, Joe Biden, president of the United States, referring to Rachel Levine as the first female four-star admiral, right, Secretary of Health. They're using biological terms, and the reason for that is that they've always been interchangeable until very recently.
Yes. All you're describing to us is that like gender is a fairly new concept, which is true, and that society hasn't caught up to how we should refer to people necessarily. You're not really, but then at the same time, you're saying, like, yeah, okay, that's normal, no? That's what happens when we shift in society.
That's a very modern change, and I would argue that that's why they're not even able to be consistent with that. So I don't understand the basis for...
Yeah, it's a modern change, so they're not consistent yet. Why is that like an argument against trans people? I don't understand.
Someone saying that gender is separate from sex, if it's not even agreed upon by the left and transgender activists today.
So,
What? What the fuck are you talking about? They're using like dated terms to refer to women. Like, here's one of the interesting things is that like, I don't think that we should just completely uproot and start like, oh fuck, we have to adhere and we have to cater to every single trans person by changing everything from female to woman and this, that. It's like, we don't have to go that crazy. Trans people just want to be accepted. We don't have to go fucking like insane. I guess Joe Biden could have said woman instead of female. Who cares? I just feel like it's like, I don't think that it's that deep in this case, but.
you say that it wasn't until very recently. I don't know how recent you're talking.
Sure. Yes. Would you like? I can answer.
Yes.
So it actually, and I would encourage you, if you do, you can go research this, because if I provide people my resources, they think I'm just lying. But I make them publicly available. Started with, there was someone named Simone de Beauvoir. 1949 was the first person to say that sex is biological and gender is societally constructed. Right. This was the first time that idea was floated.
Yes.
Sure.
But it still existed within the binary, that women could identify as men, but men could identify as women, but not this idea that there were other genders. It was still two, but that it was largely societal. It was reiterated by a few other people. Then you may have learned this in college, the John Money twins study. Did you learn that, where they raised one as a girl, one as a boy? So yeah, that was taught. I believe it's still taught in school. I don't know if you know, but both of those boys died. One committed suicide. I believe the other from a drug overdose because he sexually molested them. And the reason that's important is because, as you know, that was taught on college campus. If you raise a twin as a boy and a twin as a girl, it was proof that it was societally constructed. But it actually had lethal ramifications. Both of them had all kinds of mental health disorders and ended up offing themselves, which is a tragedy.
Well, okay, so we're talking about a very specific case where they like raised two boys. One is a male, one is a female, and they ended up having like significant mental health problems. Sure, but the thing is that nobody, when they say, this is okay. When we say that things are socially constructed, it doesn't mean that they don't have like a basis in reality, right? So, when they say gender is a social construct, it doesn't mean that like, you basically just get to like choose your gender willy-nilly, right? Like you can't just choose to be a girl or choose to be a boy. People that are actually valid in their transness and not transgenders, they genuinely have like deep feelings to an extent where they will like potentially commit self-harm, be incredibly suicidal or depressed, that their gender and their sex are like misaligned, right? It's not that people just want to choose. Like you can't just raise a biological boy as a girl and they'll turn up like a girl, right? You're going to fuck that kid up, right? It's not the same thing. It's the same thing with like you know, your hands are a social construct. Like what we call hands are a social construct. The way that we organize and classify hands is a social, like, you know, you got your fingers, your phalanges, and all that. We could have made this whole hand to be considered, like, we could have called it a penis. The word is irrelevant. We could have classified it or grouped different muscles or bones together in different ways. We could have, you know, there's so many different things, but that doesn't mean that your hand doesn't exist objectively. Just like I think trans people exist objectively as well in society. It's just like how we label them, how we classify it, how we deal with the potential mental health struggle that a trans person goes through. That's what it is. It still exists in nature. It's just like what we call it and how we classify it. It's really just a classification thing, you know? Yeah. If we could have just called hands skinny toes, for sure. For sure. That's totally fair.
Even with John Money existed within the binary. Only until Judith Butler in the 80s and 90s did they say gender is societally constructed, and by the way, there are more than two genders. And it was not created by, it was not a theory that was floated from scientists, from doctors. It was floated from existentialists and feminists. It's not rooted in reality. And before that, gender was really a grammatical term, you know, from the Romance languages, like I speak.
Okay, but now you have like a lot of mental health. So this is another thing too, is like we were really dated in our mental health study and analysis for a very long time, and we're getting better, and we're still not like all there. Just because the concept might have been floated by feminism doesn't mean that it's an invalid thing, especially when it gets picked up by, like, there are legitimate mental health counselors and doctors and therapists that understand this issue more deeply and are very affirming of it, because clearly there is some kind of an issue there or something going on. Like, that's undeniable, right?
I'm French as my first language, or, you know, any of the languages based in Latin, right? All nouns are gendered. So it's a very new theory. It's not like it's something that's been agreed upon for a long time, and now we've come full circle where we're using them interchangeably again, because we're calling transgender men to women females. That's a sex term.
We're not calling. That's like you're pearl clutching on that one. We're not calling them collectively females. And fucking 80-year-old senile man misspoke. Like, I don't know. It's not that deep. And again, on our government licenses, we don't have a section necessarily for gender yet. That's it. So
a gender term, but those are the terms we use, male to female, right?
Typically, man, woman, male, female are used interchangeably. However, I still believe that they are both very different. Because you say that it's not used a lot today. I'm a pre-nursing student, so we are very much taught that, yes, inherently they are different. I've learned that in my anatomy classes. I've learned, which it's not touched on a lot because
where's my
we very
bat's
much
penis?
do biological.
Sure. Well, you would have to.
Yes, in psychology, it is very much still taught that they're two very different things. As for...
But can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
You said you're in nursing?
Yes.
You're studying pre-nursing. So, now this matters, right? Because, for example, if someone fills out on a government form right now, they'll fill out their sex and say they're a biological male, but they fill out female. Or when they're admitted to the hospital, right? Often it's a biological term, but if they identify that way, they will often fill out, or legally they can fill out how they identify.
Yes.
Very different metrics, right? As a nurse, as a doctor, you need to know what you're dealing with.
So I just wanted to be explicitly clear. I went to the emergency room somewhat recently for a heart issue. One of the first questions they ask you is like, they basically ask you if you're trans in a nice way. They do, like, that's a very new thing. So it's like, we understand that trans women are going to generally need different treatments from cisgender women, obviously, because trans women are still biological men. They have a prostate. It's impractical and unnecessary to remove your prostate, right? He's going to get to the point where he's starting to touch on like, okay, but it's we need to acknowledge they're different. 100%, absolutely. The people who need to acknowledge trans people are different from cis people are in the cases of sports, doctors, and if you're gonna fuck them, right? That's pretty much it. That's also outside of that, socially, it doesn't matter. Well, if someone's walking around, what do you don't need to know if they're, you know, what's between their legs in general, right? But they ask you so that they can help you get specific medical treatment that you need. Like, that's just part of it. It was a bizarre question to be asked. I laughed a little bit. They're like, I forget exactly what they said. It was a nice way of saying, like, were you born a woman? And I was like, I just sat there. I'm like, fuck, do I look like I was? I'm a big motherfucker. You know what I mean? I was like, but they ask you the question. Of course, you need to make the distinction. But again, this is really just society catching up with the concept of gender. That's pretty much all it is.
Absolutely. And yes, like you said, on documents now, you can legally do the gender that you identify with, which amazing, great step forward for that. But those people do have to make sure that they're like, hey, biologically, this is what I was assigned to at birth, and you treat them using those metrics. However, that doesn't mean that you don't treat them with respect or treat them any less than how they identify.
In some instances, it's illegal to ask a follow-up question, right? It's discrimination.
What?
What do you mean against a follow-up question?
In other words, if someone comes in who's biologically a male but identifies as female, if you follow up and say, well, were you born a male? You're actually not allowed to ask that question.
I don't think that you're correct. I'm pretty sure where are you getting that from? I don't, what? Why wouldn't you be able to ask that question? That's the question they asked. I'm pretty sure that they need to ask that question and that they will ask that question. And also, if you give them your medical history, if you're a trans person and you don't want the doctor to know that you're trans, you're just hurting yourself at that point. I mean, I don't know what to fucking tell you. But why does he think that?
Depending where you are, in certain countries, that's actually considered discrimination.
Okay, not in this country. By your own. In certain countries, are we in that country? That's a dumb. Those people are just dumb. Who cares? This is a relevant argument.
Because they identify. Well, even in certain areas, there have been lawsuits in the United States that are right now going up to the Supreme Court.
Where? What lawsuits? Well, I don't even know.
I think that matters. For example, we now hear men can get pregnant. You know, as a nursing.
What do you mean? Like what? There's lawsuits. What lawsuits the fuck are you talking about? What lawsuit are you talking about where a trans person's able to sue a fucking doctor because they asked them if they were born a man or a woman? I feel like you're just lying at this point. What? This is okay. Even if you're somebody that agrees that they're, gender and sex is the same thing and blah, 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 can we just agree that, like, this is motherfucker's just weirdly lying right now? And he's just like, just be honest. Yeah, there's lawsuits. Which ones? You hear about the chicken who couldn't cross the road? Like, what's your argument? It's like bizarre. What lawsuits?
Student, it's not true. Men cannot get pregnant.
And then he moves on to men can and can't get pregnant. Like, okay. Like if you don't think that if you think that trans men are valid, then you believe that trans men can get pregnant, of course. If you don't believe that, of course. But like now we're 10 steps ahead. But which lawsuits are you talking about? Like, let's stay consistent here. What the fuck is he talking about?
For example, we now hear men can get pregnant. You know, as a nursing student, it's not true. Men cannot get pregnant.
Again,
I see here the lawsuits.
Because if you view men only from a biological standpoint and not just how they identify, then sure, biologically males cannot be. But if you identify as a male, but you have female reproductive organs, then yes, you can't get pregnant.
But if they go into your hospital, and this happens, let's say you're a nurse, they go into your hospital, right? And they identify as a woman even though they're a man. They take a pregnancy test. If a woman tests positive, that could mean she's pregnant. A man tests positive largely means he has testicular cancer.
Yes.
Right? But they don't tell you that they were born a male or a female. This is something that we are facing in our medical establishments right now. That's why Johns Hopkins said we won't perform the sexual reassignment surgery. You just saw this from the NHS in the UK. They have a problem with it. They've removed language from their website because they're finding that there are serious health consequences that come along with this. And I would say, I understand. I think I understand where you're coming from. I think you're.
What does he mean? We've gone. He's just fucking rocket shipping through multiple things. Like, yes, I guess if a guy did test positive for pregnancy, they might have cancer. Like, that's why your doctor 99,000 times out of 100,000, 99 times out of 100, they're gonna know. The doctor will know your genitals unless you like decide to not tell them. Like, so this argument is super irrelevant. As far as John Hopkins not performing gender reassignment surgery, I guess I got to look into that. Okay, what did he say really quick?
Yes, in the UK, they have a problem with it. They've removed language from their website because they're finding that there are serious health consequences that come along with this. And I would say, I understand, I think I understand where you're coming from. I think you're an empathetic person. And I would say this, I am coming from a place of I don't hate anyone who's
I'm so confused.
Yes, in the UK, they have a problem with it. They've removed language from their website because they're finding that there are serious health consequences. That's why Johns Hopkins said we won't perform the sexual reassignment surgery.
John Hopkins sexual assignment surgery. What did they say about this? John Hopkins. They won't accept sexual reassignment surgery. Okay. Long shadows cast by psychiatrists on transition finally receives at Johns Hopkins. Let's see. Nearly 4 decades after he derailed the pioneering, guilt-ridden homosexual men. What? After he derailed the pioneering transgender program at Johns Hopkins with his views on guilt. Okay, seeing his institution come full circle with the resumption of gender assignment. What is he talking about? There's no information that says that they won't do sexual reassignment surgery. Maybe they're just calling it gender affirming surgery now instead. What is he fucking talking about? What is he fucking on about? He's just like rock. When did we say that? What is he talking about?
You just saw this from the NHS in the UK. They have a problem with it. They've removed language from their website because they're finding that there are serious health consequences that come along with this. And I would say, I understand. I think.
What is he referring to?
I understand where you're coming from. I think you're. NHS in the UK, they have a problem with it. They've removed language from their website because they're finding that there are serious health consequences that come along with this. And I would say, I understand. I think I understand where you're coming from.
I don't even know what to look up because he's just fucking babbling. I'm so confused. He's being so inconcise. Like, what language did they remove? What have they changed? He seems to just be lying. I looked some of this shit up. This is bizarre as fuck. I tried to look up them not doing sexual reassignment surgery. That doesn't exist. What language did they remove? He just it's such a weird thing for Crowder to do. He just like says things that don't seem to be actually reflected in reality, and then we just roll past it. And the person that's talking to him, I don't know if they're taking it as a fact or what, but what he's saying seems incredibly inaccurate. And okay.
Person. And I would say this, I am coming from a place of I don't hate anyone who's transgender.
Okay.
I do see an astronomical suicide rate both pre and post-op.
Absolutely.
So that, again, that's not true. That's just not true. There's not an astronaut. Okay. I hate when people say it. It's just kind of annoying. So one of the things people will say a lot is that, the surgery doesn't work because, okay, start from like the beginning. People will often say that people who are trans affirming will often say that trans people need access to gender affirming care because it'll help them. And then a lot of conservatives will be like, no, it doesn't. If you look at the rates after they transition, they still have the same, like, similar rates of suicidality. The reality is that there isn't, if you would compare, and there's no test on this, but if you would compare somebody who is trans and hasn't gotten any type of gender affirming care versus somebody who's fully transitioned, you're going to see a significant reduction in mental health issues. That's just a fact, right? When we talk about transitioning and people are having similar rates of suicidality after transition, it's because there's no definitive point of transition, right? Like, after transitioning could mean that you just started socially transitioning. It could mean that you started going on hormones. It could mean that you got a singular surgery. It could mean that you got 2 surgeries, right? There's more than one. There's like top surgery, bottom surgery. There's facial feminization surgery, and we're talking about for trans women. There's other things for trans men as well. There's surgeries for your cheekbones. There's surgeries for your hairline. There's surgeries for your voice box. There's so many different surgeries, and there's not like a specific point to say like, oh, here you go. On top of that, there are trans people, especially ones who go through a male puberty, we're talking about trans men specifically, who their bodies are significantly changed in a way where they're never going to be able to look like an ideal body. So like, it's very out of context. I guarantee you if that people had access to gender affirming care in a more robust way, that yeah, you're going to see people, but this shit's expensive. Like, not everybody who's trans gets access to being able to transition. It can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know? So, and yeah, being demonized by society is negatively impacting on their mental health as well. So like we're not seeing like it's just such an out of context statistic to push out there, and Steven Crowder's so dishonest. Holy fuck. He's talking about the NHS removing women/women from their pages about ovarian cancer. Is that all that he's talking about? Okay, yeah, okay. that doesn't really sound like. It's a little weird, but it doesn't sound like it doesn't sound like an anti-trans. It's weird. He's bizarre.
And I see that as an issue that is not solved through transition.
However, I don't think.
But you're wrong.
Again, I don't think that is necessarily it is a transgender issue because transgender youth are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than the cisgender youth, and that's a very big problem. And I'm sorry, it is so loud.
No, that's okay. I know.
And
hey guys, sorry, I do want to. She has hearing aids. She has hearing aids, and it kind of sets them off. Could you just?
Oh my god! All right, listen. I'm not trying to like analyze this, but so they're screaming because they want to be obnoxious to disrupt Crowder, right? And like that's annoying, right? I want to listen to the conversation, but I just find it interesting that Crowder's response is like, guys, she has a hearing aid. It's really disruptive when you do this. It's like what? It's just a weird comment to make. Like, why does her hearing aid have nothing to do with them being fucking obnoxious? It's like a weird appeal to emotion. It's weird.
That's why I have to lean in. It causes them to buzz. Okay, that's fine. Is that okay that I asked them that?
Yeah,
When did she say that? Oh, because he has to lean in more? Okay.
I have a relative as a, and I know it can just be painful. I'm sorry.
no, it's fine. I don't mind.
okay.
It's just I am all over the place.
No, I understand.
So as a okay, that's okay. Yeah, sorry, I just wasn't expecting to be experiencing that.
That's because you're an adult.
Yeah, I was not expecting to be like, oh, she wears hearing aids. I didn't know that we were still doing that in the 21st century.
Oh, wait,
but it's okay.
was it because you said it was hurting you with the hearing aids? I'm sorry, you're upset that I.
No, I don't mean you. I just mean like other people being like, oh, well, she wears hearing aids. I'm just like, I do.
No, I was just asking them to stop yelling.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I know. I'm just listening to what they're saying because I can hear them with my hearing aids.
Oh, you can hear them?
Yeah.
Is that one of those where you can hear further away, but up close is distorted?
So, it's just understanding. So like your voice is a little bit lower, and I have
Okay.
a hard time understanding lower voices.
Oh, okay.
So yes, sir.
I can make it higher. When I get very worked up, it goes up high like this if it helps. But I try and keep it calm. So.
Yes, I completely understand. I think this should just be a very calm conversation. Yes, historically, transgender youth, especially in sentences performed by things such as like the Trevor Project, it's seen that transgender youth are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than their cisgender counterparts. And that goes even higher with people of color, especially Native American / Indigenous people. And while that is there, I don't think that is they're committing suicide, because I may be 100% misinterpreting what you were saying, how you meant that whenever you said it, but it came off as though you meant that in a way of like they're committing suicide because they're transitioning.
Yeah, well,
in the sense of like.
No, what he's saying is that he doesn't think that it's an effective treatment method because the suicidality is the same after transitioning, but it's not. Again, there's no specific point of what transitioning means. It's not after fully transitioning. It might be after a surgery. It might be after starting hormones. It might be, but this is a very lengthy process.
Like they're almost being forced to transition?
No. That's not. Let me clarify what I meant.
Okay.
Because I've sit down with a lot of people today, and the argument is consistently, well, it's because of the mistreatment. But and actually, the studies that I've seen are much higher than even 4 times. 4 times is bad enough, right? It's tragic.
Sure.
But actually, there have been studies, Swedish studies that show it.
Well, yeah, mistreatment is going to be a factor, right? So like people are going to have a higher risk of suicidality because they're being mistreated or looked down on in society. But also, some people are going to have this issue because they just have like they're just feeling dysphoric. They're feeling uncomfortable. They're feeling like incomplete in some capacity. It's not all like basically societal bullying, but it's definitely a factor for sure. Like you can't deny that.
It's 18 to 19 times more likely, but the number is the same both pre and post-op. And here's my issue. And I tried to discuss this earlier. American slaves.
I like how he gave us sources for. Let me see if I can look the thing. He gave us sources for like the suicide rates. Come see my stand-up. Get to the. What the fuck is this? Wait, why doesn't he have them in the description? He puts up a fucking post on the screen of like where you can look this stuff up, but I'm not going to type that in. The reality is that he's just referencing again after surgery. Okay, he's just incorrect about after the transition part. All right, like it's not just one surgery; it's multiple. There's multiple surgeries that you have to go through. There's multiple different like treatment methods you have to go through. So he's just wrong about that, and he doesn't even post a source anywhere. He makes it so difficult to look, and the sources that he's posting seem to only be linked to the suicide things, which are true. We already agree that trans kids especially are going to have higher rates of suicidality.
Pre and post-op. And here's my issue, and I tried to discuss this earlier. American slaves I think we would both agree were mistreated, right?
Yes.
They didn't have they didn't have the same attempted suicide rate. Jews in the Holocaust didn't have a 4-time suicide rate, not even close. Americans pre-civil rights. What I'm saying is people who have been discriminated against and truly, I think we would both agree, abused and mistreated. Even if you go to gays, for example, in the United States in the 80s during the HIV epidemic, right, where they were very stigmatized, they didn't have anywhere near this attempted suicide rate, and it exists both pre and post-op. And the reason I bring it up is because I think that I think you're a kind person. I think you're obviously a respectful person. What limited time I've had with you, I think it's misframed. For example, people think if I say the solution is not transitioning or changing the entire societal structure to limitless genders, it's not because my heart doesn't break for these people. It's because it doesn't work. It's not because of societal mistreatment, and transitioning doesn't make it any better. It may make it worse.
Okay, it's a very interesting viewpoint to have. Again, I don't necessarily agree with it, and I say this as a because I'm a queer person, and I grew up in Bible Belt, Texas. I grew up in South Texas. I grew up with very conservative family members, very religious people, and so I've experienced a lot of mistreatment, and so I completely understand. I can see that aspect of it because I have that viewpoint.
Right.
Whereas people perhaps like you may not, and that was very polarizing. I apologize.
No, I understand. And actually,
but people from your viewpoint perhaps may not be able to see it. But I do know a lot of queer people do have a lot more of those issues, not necessarily, but it was because how they were treated, which is why, again, I don't necessarily agree that it is because it is of transitioning.
Well, what I'm saying is, for example, and I would like to go back to the term queer, where you can probably educate me, because it means different things to different people, and honestly, I feel sometimes that I don't get a handle on it.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I've had two queer people sit down, and they both argued about what it meant, and I'm like, I'm just going to step out of this one. But I will say this, I was raised, I am a Christian, more conservative, but I was raised in socialist Quebec, in public schools, and also I was dual citizen, but I was raised from 3 to 18 in Canada. And I will tell you this, we actually have something called the Ligue des Langues, meaning the language police, and where they would actually enforce. I was forced, for example, to go to all French schools until the 3rd grade, where they thought I was learning disabled. And I speak French, but it's hard for me to learn math and history in French.
Oh yeah.
I have suffered from clinical depression in my life to a very severe degree.
Okay.
So I can relate to it, and I have, again, because I was very much a fish out of water, I can relate to it in a way that might surprise people, even though I'm a white male. I was an English-speaking, half-American, conservative male in a socialist, liberal province that forced me into French schools. And I think that rather than someone saying it was because of the mistreatment, but examining, finally, my issues that I could control, where I did suffer from depression and ADHD, that it helped me a lot. And I did have people who enabled it at a certain period of time.
It's just funny because I have ADHD too. I don't suffering from ADHD. Okay.
Rather than getting to the root cause. What I'm saying is, when you look at the mistreatment of groups throughout history, they still don't have anywhere near the attempted suicide rate of transgenders, including queer women in the Bible Belt. It's still not 4 times or 18 times. So there must be another variable there. And
yeah, of course. Right. So yes, like all things, it's not just mistreatment. I said this before. Mistreatment is part of it. Societal bullying is going to be part of it. But there's also an underlying mental health issue, right? So when it comes to what he compared them to slaves before, how slaves didn't even have the same rate of suicidality. I mean, first of all, what a fucking insane comparison. Because fucking nobody, gay people aren't oppressed as much as fucking literal black slaves were. But since he's making the comparison, first of all, that was a purely societal external factor, whereas there is clearly an internal factor plus a societal factor for LGBTQ people, right? Or not LGBTQ, for trans people. There's something going on if you feel so much distress that you feel like you're born in the wrong body. So there's an internal and external factor as well, right? You're dealing with a significant amount of discomfort with the fact that you feel you were born in the wrong body, right? Additional, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's pretty much what it is. We can acknowledge that both of these things are a factor, sure.
If we shut down the dialogue, we may never actually examine what that variable is.
Like I said, again, I don't 100% agree with that, especially because I'm viewing it from a youth standpoint of say, people my generation, because I know for a fact that our generation has the most mental health issues that this country's ever seen, and it's
probably what the fuck am I in here? What am I? Fuck me in the ass, bro. Why am I? Oh, because they fucked me. God damn it. Sorry. I think that part of our mental health issue in society, there's probably a collection of issues. I think that some of those issues have to do with social media. I think it's very toxic. That's a whole other conversation to have, which is an external thing. I also feel like in our Western world, people are having babies later, and we have shittier and shittier diets. There are more overweight parents. There are more people on medication, and the reality is, is that the older you have kids and the more overweight you are when you have kids, the higher chance that those kids are going to have some kind of a, they're going to have an issue. And I think that there are a lot of these factors culminating in why we have more mental health problems nowadays. It's not just one factor, but
because of circumstances that have happened as we have grown up.
Let me ask you this. Would you say, are you Generation Z?
Yes.
Okay. Would you say, and I don't want to mischaracterize this, statistically I would say this is true, but would you say that Generation Z is probably or arguably the most open-minded generation as it relates to these gender issues?
Probably,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Okay. So when you combine that with the fact that your generation still has more mental health issues than all that have come before it, how do you juxtapose that and say it's because of mistreatment? It's the most tolerant generation of all time.
Okay, it might be the most tolerant generation of all time. I get. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily tolerant. It's such a fucking. Some of these questions are so stupid. Okay, sorry. Listen, right? Gen Z is obviously more tolerant overall than probably any other group, right? But that doesn't mean that every Gen Zer is tolerant. That doesn't mean that people aren't being bullied for being trans in schools, because they're still considered fucking weird, even by their peers. It's not like every Gen Zer is like, oh my God, it all makes sense now. There's just more of them that are open to it. It's not all of them, or even most Gen Zers aren't open to or completely affirming of LGBTQ or trans issues. They're young kids and they're still bullies. And if they see somebody that looks weird, they're going to bully them. On top of that, you still have your parents, which aren't Gen Z, that don't agree with these ideas, and they're obviously passing it down to their kids. I don't know if Crowder just doesn't understand how the world works. I don't really understand it. He's like almost so fucking terminally online in his perspective of the world.
And they have more mental health issues than, for example, men coming back from World War II.
Well, I don't even know if you can make that assertion, because I doubt that we cataloged men coming back from World War II correctly when it came to their mental health struggles. We used to call it PTSD, shell shock. Like, I don't think that we have quite robust, deep examinations of mental health factors for people in World War II. I don't know if you can make that argument. I'm pretty sure that I just couldn't imagine that people come back from World War II didn't have mental health issues. We just didn't give a fuck about it, and we didn't classify it very well in society. So I'm just gonna push back on that one.
I think that's actually a great question. Good job for that.
It's not a gotcha. I'm genuinely curious.
I know, which is why I think it's an absolutely great conversation.
Okay,
so the
let's see what
reason
we
I
got.
believe that Gen Z does have the most mental health issues is you have to realize that we start, the very first year is 1998. So that means that you have 1999, 1999, 2000, 2001. The very first people were in this generation were 3 years into their lives was 9/11, which was arguably the worst terrorist attack that has happened in the United States and on American soil.
Many Gen Z, they don't even remember it. I feel really old when I talk about it. They're like,
absolutely,
I don't remember. I'm like, oh boy.
I was born in
The fuck does 9/11 have to do with this? Like, I was like 11 when 9/11 happened. I don't even remember it. Most kids that are in Gen Z, no kid in Gen Z knows what the fuck 9/11 is. There's nothing to do with anything. What is she talking about?
2003,
Hey,
so
what
I
are they
wasn't
talking
even
about?
there for that. I wasn't even a concept at that point. But
Yeah, you were prenatal.
Yeah, absolutely. But you do have to realize that the world, especially in America, changed very drastically after 2001.
Okay, sure.
It changed very drastically after. There's very much this is taught in history classes, there's very much a difference between...
Oh my God, guys, Al-Qaeda created trans people! I knew those motherfuckers did something. The destroying the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers rather, that was just a cover-up to putting something in the water that made us all kind of gay. Fucking Alex Jones was right, dude. Holy fuck. How would I not put it together, dude? We've cracked the code, bro. We've cracked the fucking code, dude.
Pre-9/11 and very much a difference between post-9/11, and post-9/11 is seen as its own part of history because a lot of things have changed. Nowadays, kids in my generation aren't allowed to go outside because they're too worried about safety, whereas
That's fair.
people, and may I ask how old you are, is that rude?
No, 35.
35?
Yeah, so I'm kind of middle young millennial. Yeah.
Yes, millennial. My parents growing up were just allowed to go outside, and their parents didn't care where they were. Whereas my
That's true.
parents were like, "No, you're a girl. You can't go outside by yourself, even if it is in suburbia." We have to deal with a lot of.
That could be a factor.
The world is very much changing, and in a lot of places, it's changed for the worse. And especially since we have a lot of media that typically just pummels you with all these bad bad things that are happening in the world, that very much changes a generation. And if you are constantly seeing that and you are constantly exposed to life-changing things, dead bodies, wars, terrorist attacks, it very much changes your perception on life. And it's very easy for people in my generation to feel hopeless because of that, not because we're open-minded. I believe
that could be a factor. I think it has a lot more to do with social media and how people are developing relationships online now. People are going outside less, they're exercising less, they're moving around less. It's a big negative impact on your fucking mental health when you don't move around. And just like working on your, like working out, working on your body, moving around, that is actually significantly positive for your mental health. I think a lot of these factors are it as well, and we're just not kind of thinking about it. I think we have a rampant issue with like eating, not just unhealthy foods, but also again we're not moving around. So like if you eat shittily, but you're working out and moving around, you're going to be healthier than somebody who's eating shittily and not doing those things, right? Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with like how squished in we are. I think COVID is probably a bigger marker for depression than 9/11. Because during COVID, people like stayed inside. They got depressed. They started gaining weight. They were doing less social interaction. And I think that even when people were able to go back to work, yeah, they felt better. But like they didn't change those habits. They got used to being lazy and depressed. I don't think 9/11 is that as significant as they're saying.
That our generation is so open-minded because we see all the bad things happening in the world. Because we're like, oh, we can at least be compassionate for one another. That's the very least we can do. In order to make ourselves happy.
I will say this. I've changed my mind on issues in the past. I don't think you've changed my mind on this issue. But but what you have done is present a compelling argument that I think should be included. I've discussed this in the past, that we certainly do have. Let me put it this way. I don't think that this Generation Z has it harder than 16-year-olds on the beaches of Normandy.
No, of course. But I understand what you believe.
I believe they had a sense of purpose, right? That they were fighting an evil Nazi regime. Whereas I do think your point is well taken when you combine this constant flow of information and, yes, negativity with what I do think is, considering this kind of, like you said, post 9/11, post-war in the global sense generation, a lack of purpose. That it's a chronic stressor rather than an acute one.
Yes, because
and I can see how that could be damaging.
You have to remember that a lot of those boys that were set off in the...
It doesn't sound like he changed his mind on anything at all. It just made it seem like he... It just felt like he... okay, so what it sounded like he was doing there, he's like, yeah, you know what? I didn't change my mind on this topic, but you brought something up that made me shift my perspective slightly. I don't think he changed his perspective at all on anything. I don't know what we're talking about here.
War also, a lot of them typically lied on their things to go off to war because that was something they needed for their families and stuff like that. So some of them wanted to go to war.
And they felt a sense of purpose. They wanted to serve their country.
At what cost? But they...
Sure, I guess. Maybe we do lack a sense of purpose. That could be part of it. I also, again, don't think that these kids came back mentally balanced in any capacity. We had a society that was like, yeah, just suck it up and deal with it. There's plenty of people with PTSD. We just didn't know how to treat it or categorize it very well. And they probably had bad treatment methods for things like shell shock to the point where people would be like, no, I'm fine. I don't want to get fucking prodded with a fucking anal bead. I don't know how they would treat it. But you get my point.
Ended up doing that, yes. So, yes, it's very much a chronic stressor of constant things. Like, you have to, like, we have Ukraine and Russia. And we're seeing that all over. We've lived through that. We've all lived through a global pandemic. But I was in high school whenever that happened. And I was supposed to be graduating. And we had to wear masks. We had to social distance from each other. And it was very hard to have that social thing, as it was for everyone in the world. We've had that. We've had all sorts of things that have happened within our lifetime that are these big global events, which is why I don't think being open-minded.
Well, we used to have those same global events. The thing is that makes it a little different when they're talking about Russia, is that like that has no real impact on us, but it feels like it does. Well, I mean, I guess it did contribute to inflation to an extent with the energy costs, but it feels like it does because, again, we have social media and we have the advent of like the computer and technology to make things that are happening all over the world seem like we can make it seem like they're more prevalent, right? So with the ability to exchange information is a great thing, but then also now we're seeing a lot of negative things that are going on in the world. Now we're like, oh my God, this is so scary. Did you hear about this? Did you hear about this? Like, it's more of just we see it more, we can hear it more. It's more in our faces, so it seems like it's worse. I think that things are just as safe, if not safer nowadays. It just feels like they're less safe, and it can absolutely contribute to like this like almost global anxiety for a lot of people. Like, oh my God, something's happening here, you know.
did is inhibiting us at all.
No, and I wasn't saying, because you're two kind of separate issues. I think we both agree there are more mental health issues with this generation than previous generations. But what I am saying is that this generation, for example, the transgender suicide statistics, don't really change generationally. So you would think that transgenders from, let's say, millennials or from Gen X, you would think that the rates would be higher there. They're every bit as high with Gen Z. So I'm saying separate from the suicide and mental health issues at large, the treatment of them is certainly what people would consider more tolerant with Gen Z, but the metrics haven't improved. And so I would say, well, okay, maybe we need to look to another.
So he's saying that the metrics generationally haven't improved. So like a 30-year-old trans person, 30-year-old trans people have the same suicidality as 20-year-old trans people. That might be true. That might be true. But are we comparing trans people that were 30 from 20 years ago to trans people who are now 30, right? Like 30-year-olds 20 years ago? Because the way that we've treated this is like, it's an ongoing issue. The reality is that trans is very new, and it's very new to being treated. And part of the way that you treat things is through trial and error. You can't test this on monkeys, right? Monkeys don't have the concept of gender. So there's going to be people who get it right. There's going to be people who get it wrong. Newer studies seem to suggest that we're on the right track for treating people. It's not just about a surgery. It's also about proper mental health counseling as well, right? Like that's what it is, you know, setting up realistic expectations. One of the first things that they'll do when you go into like, you know, talk, when you get diagnosed, they try to they try to give you a perspective of like, hey, what do you want to look like? Go to the mall and find somebody. What do you want to look like? Versus like, and then as you move on and start transitioning, you know, through hormones and therapy and surgeries, they try to reel in your expectations so that you don't, you know, be too unrealistic. Like if I went in and I was like, I'm trans and I want to look like Emma Stone. Why Emma Stone? I don't know. Chances are I'm never going to have the ability or capacity to look like fucking Emma Stone. So as the years go by and I go to my therapist, we're going to have to work on my reeling in my expectations a little bit. Right? And that's how it kind of works. It's not as black and white. These things take time, right?
Another variable. There is no demographic that has that same attempted suicide rate. Well, there's only one.
Yeah.
And it's paranoid schizophrenics. It's the only place that has a over 40% attempted suicide rate, which is approximate with transgender individuals.
Okay.
Which brings me kind of to another point. I really do think that's a thoughtful point that you made, and I actually would like to go do more research and actually look at the before and after 9/11 mental health.
I'd really like to know what Steven Crowder thinks the solution is for people that have gender dysphoria or trans people. Like, what would he do? Because I never really see the proposition of like, oh, good point. Like, what would you do? Oh, well, I would take a dump on their chest or something. I don't know. Right? Like, I would like to hear like what he thinks is the right thing to do to have a better outcome here. Maybe that would be a good place to kind of start a little bit. Yeah, maybe that would be a good place to start.
Issues. I think it's an interesting study. But my question would now bring to, if we say, first off, can I ask you a question? How many genders are there? If I say there are two.
I've actually watched some of your stuff, and I know you don't like this answer. I know you don't. I'm so sorry that you don't like this answer.
I appreciate you can probably understand.
Yes.
Okay.
Like I said, I have people in my life that very much are like, there are only two genders,
right.
and I'm just like, I do believe that is an infinite spectrum. I do believe that you can identify with what you are. And so if you...
I mean, there might be a spectrum. Like, even, like, sex is a spectrum, right? Like, no two men look the same. Everybody has different level of testosterone levels, different penis sizes, different this and this or that. Just because we could technically classify people as men and female, men and women, men and women, males and females. We could classify that on a spectrum in some capacity, too. Like, if you have lower estrogen, maybe you're more like a girl, right? Like, so here we could do like this if we wanted to, right? So here's, like, men, and then here's women, right? Papa Gut's obviously a man. Right? Got lots of testosterone. But then let's say there's somebody with like less testosterone, like Steven Crowder. Maybe you can consider him more of a woman. This could be a gender. Steven Crowder gender. Has less. You get my point, but we don't classify things like that. And my point is that like just because there could potentially be an infinite classification doesn't mean we need to have that. Man, woman, and something in between, non-binary, right? I understand that, but we don't have to individually classify everything as like, oh, well, I'm a this gender. Why? Like, what's the significance or importance of that? There is none, right? You don't have to get that deep into it. I say that there's 3 genders. There's no reason to go beyond that. There's literally no reason to go beyond that.
if you identify as someone that's non-binary, I believe that you should be allowed to do that, and I believe that you should be allowed to do that, and people should be respectful about it. I do think that on the number of genders, I don't think there is a limited number. I think you can identify how you want to identify. Typically, people tend to identify as a man, woman, non-binary, but even then, I don't like, because non-binary is a umbrella term,
Right.
where it, of course, covers all of these nuanced gender identities. But some people don't like the term
But then
non-binary.
where do you draw a line?
Where do you draw a line?
For example, like, and I'm taking an extreme example to make a point here. I'm not saying this is the norm,
Yeah.
but if someone identifies as a feline, you know, someone,
feline.
this happens a lot.
That'd
If
be
someone,
fine.
a more
I like how he's like, this is an outlier. Like, listen to what he says.
draw a
And
line.
where do you draw a line?
For example, like, and I'm taking an extreme example to make a point here. I'm not saying this is the norm,
Yeah.
but if someone identifies as a feline, you know, someone,
feline.
this happens a lot. If
So he says, this isn't the norm. This is an outlier. And then he's like, this happens a lot. Those things don't mean the same thing. No, that doesn't happen a lot. There are fucking crazy people who are pretending to identify as felines. Obviously, you can't be a feline gender. That's not a gender. That's like a fucking species, and you're a human being, right? Yeah, of course you can't do that.
a more common issue is people identify as amputees. Right? This is an issue where
What?
medical professionals are having people come in asking them to remove a limb. Right? If you say it's infinite, well, then there
What's
is
the
no
number on that happening? Do you happen to know?
I would say
don't-
if it's 100, if it's 1,000, if it's any, and it shouldn't be a medical quandary. As an
Okay, but like, there's a difference between an amputee and somebody with gender dysphoria, right? Like, I mean, it's just a pretty significant difference. What the fuck is he talking about? Amputees? It's such an outlier. It's an irrelevant, like, it's an irrelevant comparison. What's the point of the comparison? What is his point?
nurse, you know what I mean? It shouldn't be an ethical quandary, but now it is. And what I would say is, look, we've had two genders, and we understand. I think you seem intelligent enough to know that I acknowledge the 0.01% who are intersex, and these are anomalies. It's not the same as the transgender
I
issue.
do believe, you said 0.01?
It's 0.01 as far as intersex.
I believe that that was from a study in 2002, and I believe the number now is about 1.7%, which is about the same number of redheads.
That's not the truth. I don't say I'm not. I've seen this conversation before. It's not that many, and it's irrelevant if it is. I don't remember exactly what it was. I would have to look into it. But that was debunked in actually. Steven Crowder talked to somebody last time. The reason I remember this is because Steven Crowder talked to somebody the last time that was like a fucking journalist or something. He was an idiot. And he said it was like 1.7. And I was like, no, it's not. And I looked into it and it wasn't 1.7. It was a bizarre classification somebody made. I don't remember the specifics. You can look it up, but it's not 1.7 and it's irrelevant if it is. It's not relevant at all if it is or not.
In the world, so that's like 70.
I know that's that they brought up, but then actually we had a what's his name, the journalist Scaramucci. I can't remember his name when I was at UTD. Try and bring that up, and in that very study, it actually said the number is closer to point.
Yeah.
So even in that study, they had misread the statistics. It's certainly not over 1%, but we can disagree. It's still very, very low. I would maintain it's not only a 2002 study. There have been studies reiterated since then. But even then, what I would say is this: let's say it's 1% for the sake of argument. In nursing school, for example. It's certainly a higher percentage of people who are born without a limb than people who are intersex.
Yes.
But you're still taught in biology class, there are exceptions. Human beings generally have 2 arms, 2 legs. For example, you use hearing aids, right?
Yes.
But in biology, I'm sure in nursing school, they probably teach you basics about the eardrums, right? Basic about the ear canal, and there are exceptions to these rules, but this is generally the human anatomy.
Okay.
We are now asking people to restructure how we teach biology based on a very small percentage. And if we say, well, no, 2 genders is wrong. If you tear down that...
Wait, what do you mean we're teaching different ways? What? That's not happening. What are you talking about? We don't teach different people different ways to deal with biology. What do you mean? No, we don't. We're just asking people to be like affirming of people that have gender dysphoria or people who are trans. What does he talk about? We don't make these massive concessions. Oh, fuck, I passed the way we were supposed to go. We don't make these massive concessions like he's suggesting we do.
What I would say is a fundamental structure in society. I think you need to replace it with something equally concrete, not it could change at any time.
You say that we're teaching people that there's more than there actually is. Biologically, we are not. We're not being taught that.
As far as sex.
And yes, as far as sex, we're not being taught. Sure, it is mentioned that there are intersex people, and I don't think that we should look over those people because they have identities. They have, and they present their own set of medical things that you have to look into because nowadays you hear a lot of stories about intersex people who have had organs removed as children without their consent, and that's a very hard thing. And so you can't completely overlook.
No, I don't overlook.
Especially if the organ was a penis. That's a pretty hard thing.
people.
But I'm saying how we teach it. How we teach it is that we have male and female, like you said. They teach two, and they teach there are some exceptions. But they don't teach that there are limitless sexes. They teach
No,
it, right.
because sex and gender, again, are two things, and we were taught that
But
there's...
that's not.
Okay, but from a medical perspective, like, who fucking cares? Like, none of this matters. You don't have to acknowledge. He makes these weird claims that like we're doing these drastic we're not changing. Like, people are being educated about trans people, of course. Some people are fucking annoying and they go a little too far. But like, we're not changing like fundamentals of life by saying that trans people exist in some capacity. Like, we're not restructuring the way that we teach anything other than being respectful. Like, I'm maybe he's just not communicating very well.
Not where we are, though, right? Because when you have people, again, if this would be, I would agree with you, at least the premise. If, for example, consistently, male and female were used to describe sex, and man and woman were used to describe gender, but they're not.
They are. You're wrong. What are you talking about? Again, it's a new concept, like you said. Just because Joe Biden didn't call like a trans person a female doesn't mean that he's correct. It's just you can either call it a misspeech or just like dated language. Like, again, he's an old person, so he's not gonna he's old, so he's not gonna understand the specifics. He's just like, female means woman, regardless. And now we're changing it to be like, oh, female is the medical classification, basically, and like girl or a woman is more of like the gender classification, right? But this isn't like a widespread fucking terminal issue that he's trying to, excuse me, present it as. It's so weird. Like, he falls back onto these really weak arguments. Like, I don't understand. It's bizarre. It's just a bizarre argument.
They're not even in a legal sense when you're talking about proper identification. They're not when you talk about this administration referring to Rachel Levine as a female. They're not even used that way when you say male to female transgender, right? They're talking about, we both agree you can't change your biological sex, but it's MTF, FTM, male.
Okay, so then, Crowder, then if he actually believed that this was an argument, then his advocacy would be on changing, updating the correct language. That's it. It's just dated language. It's not. It's such a weird thing. Like, you could be invalidating of trans people outside of being like, well, technically we don't use the right words. Okay, relax. It's not that deep. It doesn't need to be that big of a deal. Like, okay, that's not like your end all be all. It's like, yeah, if we were consistent. Okay, so like when you want to do like a really big societal overhaul to change these things, and then you'd be like, well, no, I don't want to do that because I don't think that trans people should be validated. Okay, so like, what the fuck's your point? Like, okay, we use dated language. We still have MTF on your driver's license. We still use just like sex on your driver's license. So we should change that to gender instead. We should be a little more consistent. Well, the government works slow. I don't know what to tell you.
To female, not MTW, not man to woman. There's no consistency.
Okay.
And the issue is when you combine that with the compulsion of language, for example, in Canada, or in certain areas, speech laws. If we say there are limitless genders, then there are limitless pronouns.
Yeah.
Which I would just...
Hey, well, don't live in fucking Canada.
And I'm actually learning Spanish because I'm biracial. My dad, or my mom is white. My dad is Mexican.
Wait, my wife said, wait, they don't use MTF or FTM anymore? That's not what people use anymore? Oh. So my wife is pretty keen on the gays, you know what I mean? What do they use now then? If they don't use male to female, what is it that they use? What the fuck do they use then? How do they just call them like trans women and trans men? Oh, okay. So we don't even use MTF or FTM anymore, Shrouder. So you're not even right about that. I didn't even know that. So, you know, God bless you. Okay.
And so I'm currently in the process of learning Spanish, which is also a Romance language. But
gendered nouns, right?
Yes,
Masculine
it's
and feminine.
very, very gendered.
We're one of the few languages that don't have it actually in English. It's very common, and yeah.
And again, very much like you said, there is a institution that oversees the use of the Spanish language and what is correct and what's incorrect. And this institution is very much like gender-neutral pronouns aren't to be used.
Right.
But people within those communities have very much reclaimed that right, especially those in Latin America or like people you see here in the United States, which is why you have terms such as Latinx, or you have different terms. So that is slowly beginning to
That's
change.
a good point. Yeah, we just use trans men and trans women. We don't use FTM or FTM or MTF. Okay, yeah, so Crowder's not even right about that classification. So we've been, if anything, we've been making progress towards doing what Crowder ultimately wants, guys, which is just to use the right pronoun. Just to use the correct words. Then trans people will be affirmed. That's all it is.
Again with the times
Yeah,
of people having gender identity. I would argue
it's not as far as Latinx because the vast majority of people, both in South America, Latin America, and Hispanic Americans, it's less than 2% who like the term Latinx, and it's more than 50% who hate it, across all generations.
I know that's. I don't think that's correct at all. It's
statistically
again,
it is though.
Again, I think it has to do with generations. I know a lot of young people who very much prefer that term over older people. But then again, those older people...
In the United States, not in Latin America.
The older people that I know, again, are the same kind of people that would agree with
no,
that
but I'm not talking about older people. I'm talking about younger people in Latin America or even younger people in Mexico. They do not like it's exclusively, respectfully, largely white Americans who use that term, not even young Hispanics. But let me ask you this, and I would like to go back to the sort of the queer topic, but use that term, the queer topic, but the term and how it identifies, because it does tie into this. I have asked this question here today, and understand this is not a gotcha. It is a serious concern.
The only statistic I can find seems to say that 3% of people use Latinx, 20% of people don't use it, and then 76 just haven't heard of it. Not that 50% hate it. I don't know where he's getting 50% hated from.
Like me as a father, the idea now, and when I brought this up in 2018, people said that's absurd. You're trying to be incendiary. The idea of transitioning or puberty blockers for children. You're a nurse as well. You're going to be a nurse.
Yes.
Apologies. Can we find common ground here? I've spoken with some people today. One person who is pro-LGBT agreed with me. One person did not believe that children should be allowed to make those decisions to transition. If we can't find common ground that children are in no position to make permanent decisions regarding their biological makeup and blocking puberty or undergoing gender reassignment surgery, as civil as this discourse has been, I don't think there's any hope to find common ground. Where do you line up on children transition?
Yeah, so listen, man. This is like a really complex topic. I think ideally, like kids shouldn't go on puberty blockers or anything. Here's the thing, bro. This is my one thing. If I had a kid that had such a significant mental health issue that they like had like an increased like chance of like suicidality, they were incredibly depressed, even if they weren't going to kill themselves, they were just depressed constantly because of it. They were evaluated by a mental health professional who was like advising me that like this seems to be something that's significantly impacting them. I think I would want to help my kid be happy, even though I wouldn't want my kid to be trans, but I want them to be happy. And so the concept of potentially using hormone blockers, like, I mean, I just, if my kid was experiencing that much distress and the therapist confirmed that it was justifiable or it was real distress rather, I don't know, man. Like maybe some kids should be able to. I just feel like I'm more apprehensive about like, you know, whether we're sure or not that they actually have gender dysphoria and that it's not just like a fucking trans trending phase, you know? That's more where I'm at. But it's a hard thing because I don't want a kid that's I truly don't want to know what it's like to have to raise a kid that's trans. I mean, that's just too much. That's a struggle that I don't know if I'm ready to I'll love my kid if they're trans and I'll help them as much as I can, but that's a struggle, bro. Being trans and having a trans kid, that's a fucking struggle. You know, and on the one hand, it's like, yeah, it's a permanent decision. It could impact their fertility as they get older. It could definitely be something that could change them for life. There could definitely be side effects, but if overall it keeps my kid alive or happier, even if there are, I don't know, happiness aspects going along with it, like, I mean, maybe that's still the right decision to make, you know?
I personally, just because I think that's completely different from what is being advertised right here.
Well, no, let me explain to you why it's not.
I think it's a very nuanced topic. I believe that it should be up to the child and the parents, up to doctors, I don't think it should be made illegal because that just, there are very, how do I phrase this? Sorry, I'm trying to get my...
I will say, I completely believe it should be illegal for the same reason that 10-year-olds can't consent to sex.
Okay.
If a child can't consent to sex, why can they consent to a sexual reassignment surgery that will affect them?
Well, so just so you know that the sexual reassignment surgery isn't actually sex. Hot take. First of all, children can consent to sex. They just can't consent to sex with adults. I mean, you just want to be very explicitly clear about this. Kids can consent to sex with other kids, so you know. So they can't consent to sex with adults, obviously. That's number one. Number two, these are very different things. Like, we have to understand that, right? Like a kid not having sex with an adult, they're not going to kill themselves. There's no mental disorder or you know, mental incongruence or issue with kids not being able to have sex with fucking adults, right? This is a very different thing that's being like closely studied and advised by mental health professionals who are hopefully looking for the best interest. I would imagine most of them are looking for the best interest of the child and their job as well, because if they're unsuccessful and make a bunch of unhappy children, then, you know, it's obviously not good for them. But yeah, it's not sex. Sexual reassignment surgery. It isn't even sexual reassignment surgery. It's gender like gender confirmation surgery. It's not sexual reassignment anymore. That's like a dated term. So yeah, I understand where he's coming from. It's definitely a big decision to make, which is why like the parents, that's the doctors and the even the kids need to obviously be on the same page, you know.
Their sex life forever.
Okay.
I don't know why we would leave that decision to a child. Children are not capable. Their brains are not developed and capable of making a permanent life-altering decision like that and understanding the consequences. Could we not agree at waiting until they're 18 to make that decision rather than rushing them along as children?
I do think.
Yeah, and like I think ideally that you would wait until they're 18, of course. But I think the problem is that like going through puberty, if you have gender dysphoria and like you're 12 and you start going through puberty, you might have like significant issues. And then you're going to need more surgeries, you know what I mean? Especially if you're a trans woman, because it's harder to feminize the body than it is to make it more masculine. You know what I mean? You're just saving money in the long run if you transition your kid, yeah, early. Yeah, I mean it's such a hard topic to talk about. I really just hope I don't have a kid that's trans. That's such a difficult thing to help your kid through. I hope I don't have to make that decision. You know what I mean?
That so again, you use puberty blockers, which is typically used for children. Yes, I'm not sure that the rates of gender reassignment surgery in trans children is very high for the fact that most doctors are not going to want to do that, as it is seen that most doctors aren't wanting to do gender reassignment surgery that you mentioned earlier with John Hopkins saying, I don't know about that. So that rate is not that high.
Well, it's not high yet, right? That's the reverse nirvana. Well, like, since it hasn't happened yet, but if we open it up, for example, there are lawsuits against Johns Hopkins right now, right? Just because we haven't done it yet, it's because there have been archaic fossils like me who say.
I mean, I couldn't find what he was talking about with John Hopkins. I wasn't really sure what he was referring to.
We can't allow children to transition. If we allow it, you're going to have a much, much higher number, right? We do have to make a decision.
Well, I mean, if you use it, that argument is kind of if we don't let people if we let people do this, the numbers are going to get higher. Typically, in a lot of things, that's not how it ends up seeing.
With children, it does. Let me give you, and this is something that is, and this is something that is important. Again, with children, for example, children who identify as transgender, if you do nothing, if you don't intervene, the lowest number you will find from a larger study is about 85%. There are numbers as high as 97% of them grow out of it completely.
So this is not true. We've talked about this before. It's just so childish and annoying. Back in the day, we used to have a different classification for gender dysphoria. I think it was something along the lines of like gender incongruence. And little gay boys that were slightly feminine would be diagnosed with this thing. You were some gay kid, you're gender incongruent. I forget the specific of what it's called. As we've gotten more intelligent, we realize, gay kids aren't the same as trans kids. Okay? And we have a better way to classify and differentiate kids that are just kind of gay, that like girl stuff, versus somebody who actually has gender dysphoria, where they have a significant amount of the stress associated with their gender and their sex not aligning. What he's saying is emphatically incorrect. If anything, it is proof that since we had a poor classification in the past for gender dysphoria, that clearly this is something that we are still not at at capacity with. We still haven't figured it out. But he's being incredibly dishonest about this. This is not true. This isn't a true thing. This isn't a reality. It's not a fact. People don't just grow out of being trans. That was a poor classification when it came out. It's just not correct. What he's saying is just objectively incorrect. So
they were a tomboy. Some of them were gay, right? They weren't transgender.
Yeah, because they classified fucking tomboys as like transgender in some capacity. That was the problem. Fucking misdiagnosing. Now, if you wanted to say that like that since they were misdiagnosing then, what's to say we don't have it perfect now? Great argument. But that's not what he's saying. What he's basically saying is acknowledging that we used to fucking diagnose tomboys like as fucking people with gender dysphoria, which isn't true. We still have tomboys, though there are less of them. I will say it's bizarre. Right? So this is just not an honest statistic. They're two completely separate and different classifications.
The moment you intervene and you administer puberty blockers or hormone replacement therapy, the number goes down to 0.
What?
And by the way, once that number goes down to 0, that means that 100% of those children are now in the 42% attempted suicide demographic.
But who's to say that?
What is he talking about? That last point is just not even true. Where are you even getting that from? Once you... What? Hold on. Sorry.
Replacement therapy, the number goes down to 0. From a larger study, if you do nothing, if you don't intervene, the lowest number you will find from a larger study is about 85%. There are numbers as high as 97% of them grow out of it completely. They were a tomboy. Some of them were gay, right? They weren't transgender.
Yeah, they were misdiagnosed.
When you administer puberty blockers or hormone replacement therapy, the number goes down to 0. And by the way, once that number goes down to 0...
So I think he's trying to suggest that once you put people on puberty blockers, that reduces the... That means that you're basically creating a trans person. Like if you put them on hormone blockers, you're actually hurting them by making them trans. Whereas, like, again, these are two different classifications. If anything, if it goes down to 0, if I'm understanding him correctly, because he's hard to understand because he doesn't make any decent points. It's hard to watch Crowder. What it sounds like is that everybody who goes on hormone replacement therapy is happy with the decision. I don't what are you trying to say? This is so inconcise. Steve Crowder is awful. He's just like, it's not like that he's a bad person, not that he's a great person. He just doesn't, like, nothing he said, like, you could listen. I've heard people disagree with trans people in a more intelligent way. Crowder's just unintelligent in his, like, arguments against trans people. It's fucking insane.
0, that means that 100% of those children are now in the 42% attempted suicide demographic.
But who's to say that the children that don't get help before aren't also going to be in that same demographic?
Because they grow out of it. Statistically,
They
they grow out of
don't.
it.
No, they don't.
It was a phase.
You're a
liar. It's 85 to 97%.
You're wrong.
They
You're
grow out of
dumb.
it, just like kids grow out of a lot of things.
You're dumb.
I don't necessarily agree with that because, especially in, again, may I ask, are you in the LGBTQ plus community?
No, I'm
Okay.
not LGBTQ,
So-
but I'm talking about the fact is most of these
No,
children...
it's not.
Some of them do
Not a fact.
You know what? It turns out I have a friend actually on the show said, I thought I was trans. Turns out I was just a gay man. So some of those 90-something% end up being gay or lesbian. But they all grow out of claiming to be transgender.
No, they don't.
The vast majority. Only when you...
He's referring to misdiagnosis. People who are misdiagnosed. When we used to call it like fucking gender wiener or whatever the fuck, I forget what it's called. It's like, oh, sorry, it was called gender identity disorder back then. When it used to be classified as gender identity disorder, just clicked. That's when it was overdiagnosed and it wasn't proper. Now we've changed it. It's gender dysphoria. It's diagnosed better. I'm sure that there are still some kinks to work out, but he's just not right. He's incorrect about what he's saying. He's just objectively not correct about this. They don't just grow out of it. It's not magical. It's like Crowder thinks that he like knows something that we don't, but he doesn't. Like your information. It's very clear that you're cherry picking your information. That's what's very clear to me. Very clear to me here. Sorry, let me just like 2 seconds. There we go.
And you change the neurochemistry, which we know if you administer puberty blockers or estrogen or testosterone, right? That changes the way the brain develops. Now you've actually changed their course. They grow out of it.
This is the problem with doing like a sit down with Steven Crowder where it becomes unproductive. It's because Crowder's able to sit down and bring up these dishonest, out of context statistics, and you're not prepped for them because like you're just a kid on campus getting ready to have a conversation. So when he pulls out the numerous like misinformed takes, you're like, how do I respond to this? Because they're so fucking preposterous. It's like, how the fuck do you respond to this insane person, you know?
No longer identify as trans if there's no intervention when they are children.
But who's to say that they can't detransition? Because again, that argument is right up.
And now this person doesn't understand that like Crowder's a fucking moron that's basically lying. Where's my fucking res people, heal people? Like, do you have a fucking are you stupid? Like, holy fuck. Yeah.
It's actually, they've discovered that it's kind of being blown up, kind of out of proportion, the number of people that, the media very much blows up the number of people that are detransitioning whenever it's not as big as many people think.
Well, they're dismissed and they're marginalized.
But if that number if that's so significant, and the argument that of people transitioning is like, oh, what if they want to detransition? Why can't you say the same thing for these children? Again, gender reassignment
because it's
surgery.
a Hippocratic oath, first do no harm, and puberty blockers and intervention hormonally on a child absolutely does more harm than doing nothing. We would have to agree that maybe the harm, some people would argue the harm is minimal.
But no, it doesn't do like you don't know that. You can't accurately say it does more harm than doing nothing because your nothing statistic, like your statistic where if we do nothing everything gets better, is not true. If it was, then we wouldn't be advising people to Like, this is the problem. In order for you to believe Steven Crowder, you need to believe that there is an actual LGBTQ conspiracy taking over the world. Doctors aren't so woke that they're like, oh my God, well, the treatment method of doing nothing has a 90% success rate, but let's do something instead. Apparently for money. I don't know what the argument is. Like, that's the problem, is that, like, it has to be founded on a fucking conspiracy. He's like, yeah, 90% of the time it just goes away. So why aren't we doing that? Oh, wow, maybe you're not right. Like, it doesn't make sense what you're saying. It's such a weird, you're insane. Like, you're just so wrong. It's fucking crazy.
But no one is arguing that puberty blockers do not come with the risk of sterility, a high risk when compared to other drugs.
Good.
No one is arguing that puberty blockers often stunt growth permanently. Of course we acknowledge that. No one is arguing that administering testosterone...
Well, I don't know if we acknowledge that. It's most likely true, for sure. I think like some... okay, sure.
...to a teenage girl will change her body, her bone mineral density, which to an unnatural degree. No one is arguing that, or that estrogen for a young boy will result in developmental abnormalities in their cerebral cortex, their frontal lobe. No one is arguing that those aren't...
What do you mean developmental abnormality? You're just wait.
That no one is arguing that administering testosterone to a teenage girl will change her body, her bone mineral density, which to an unnatural degree. No one is arguing.
Well, yeah, isn't that the goal? Isn't that the goal to change their? Nobody will argue that giving a young girl hormones that will make them like male hormones will make them more like men. Like, yes, isn't that the point though? Like that's the desired outcome, right? Like isn't that the whole point? Anything would reduce osteoporosis because, you know, osteoporosis is usually associated with estrogen.
Or that estrogen for a young boy will result in developmental abnormalities in their cerebral cortex, their frontal lobe. No one is arguing.
Yeah, isn't that the desired goal? Wouldn't the abnormality be that makes them more like a girl? Like, I don't understand.
So in other words, medical intervention when they're a child absolutely does more harm than waiting until they're an adult. I don't think that's as to what degree of harm, but it does more harm than doing nothing. Would be my position.
And again, I guess I'm looking at this at a very different viewpoint because I'm wanting to be a nursing student. And you were fundamentally taught that not only is the physical body something that you treat, the mind is also something. Those are two very interconnected things.
Sure.
In order for a person to be healthy, not only do they have to have a healthy body, but they also have to have a healthy mind. So with that, I'm looking at it at the sense of if these children, again, because me and you look at that suicide rate very differently, which is where I think we're coming at kind of like this.
Well, I think we both have concern, though, which I appreciate.
Yes,
just different solutions.
Different form. Oh, so
no, that's fine. Don't worry about it.
Different forms of concern, I think, because again, I think that I'm not 100% sure that children should have gender reassignment surgery just because it's a very invasive procedure. And
well, no, kids shouldn't be having surgeries. Of course not. Like, that's obviously fucking insane. There's no well, most of the time you need a surgery anyway. It's like you shouldn't be cutting. Like, you don't need to deal with your kids. The kid doesn't need bottom or top surgery. Hormone blockers, it's a different conversation.
I don't believe that they should be able to have that until they're 18. But that's just my opinion. If this child is deemed, if it's deemed medically necessary to have it for, like, say, their mental health, then because gender dysphoria is a very awful thing.
But it doesn't improve your mental health. It doesn't. That's the point. The problem is, in other words, if you were to be able to say, if we intervene, this is medically necessary for their mental health, but the attempted suicide rate stays the same, irrefutably. It does not.
It's not give me 15 minutes to type this out. Because he doesn't put them in his description like an honest person would. He makes sure that he makes it as hard as possible to actually like look at the statistics he's promoting. I put it in exactly. I'm not seeing it as it doesn't come up with anything. Did he put this in his thing incorrectly?
That's the point. The problem is, in other words, if you were to be able to say, if we intervene, this is medically necessary for their mental health, but the attempted suicide rate stays the same, irrefutably. It does not improve post-op. You've now performed, by what you've described, and I agree with you, a very medically invasive, whether it's surgery or puberty blockers, and you've not improved the mental health. As a matter of fact, you could make it worse once that child grows up and realizes, oh my God,
Because again, like this statistic, like, it's not based off of actual transitioning, like fully in any capacity. I don't know what post-surgery means, that the suicide rate stays the same. I wish that he would give us a link, a reference.
Would have grown out of it, but they never were given the chance to. I think.
And again, you can medically detransition, which is
not everybody can with puberty blockers. It's not true. They're puberty blockers. They come with some ramifications that can be permanent for many people.
Like what? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know how permanent. Maybe. I don't think that we have enough studying to know if they're permanent. I think Crowder's just making an assertion that may not be correct.
Both, yes. Not everyone, but a significant percentage.
Yes, I do know this because I've seen many videos and case studies of this detransitioning where they do have some of those things. And yes, there's some things that you can't change, but which is why I say if you're so worried about them growing out of it, don't let them surgically transition until they're 18. Again, but that I think should be up to the discretion.
Some of them do not revert back to a normal puberty phase. A good portion of them. The idea that
they might not. The problem is that none of the statistics you're pushing are correct. So I don't know how much you can't just trust your word for anything. I can't even find these like statistics about like the death of like the suicidality staying the same. You can't even link the correct fucking statistic.
That, in other words, we say, well, if you use puberty blockers, it's reversible. Well, it's not always reversible. You know what is reversible?
It may not be reversible.
Going through puberty and when you're an adult capable of making decisions, deciding to transition.
And that's not necessarily true either, because like once you go through puberty, your body goes through significant changes that can be very almost impossible to reverse. And I'm not saying that we should be throwing kids on hormones. All I'm saying is that like you're wrong about the reversibility of it. Like it's if you go through a male puberty especially, it takes like a significant amounts of like hormones and surgery to kind of get to a point where you look more like a woman, really, you know? Sorry if that came off as insensitive, but
yeah, like I said, I do think we're hitting our wall. Okay. Which is, but that's completely okay.
I think we have more common ground than maybe. I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And I really do appreciate how respectful you've been. I'm sorry that these hooligans have been yelling. Let me ask you. You said queer.
Yes, sir.
So, to a silly cis straight white male like myself. What is that? When you say queer, what do you mean?
Okay.
Some people mean it in different ways.
Yes, sir. Okay. So, you don't mind me calling you sir, right?
No, you can call me whatever you want.
Okay, because I know some people, I grew up very much where manners are very much a thing, and I know some other places it's like if you're called sir, like you're calling him old, that's rude.
No, you can call me whatever you want. You've been very respectful, and I really have enjoyed our conversation.
Okay, me too. So I very much, I completely forgot the question. Okay, queer. I was like, I'm so sorry. So yes, historically, queer has been used to mean the word strange, odd. That's very much a thing.
I still use it when watching. It used to be a term like on boxing. They say the guy gets like clipped. They would say, oh, it's put him on Queer Street, and that just meaning that he's out of it. So it wasn't a sexual term. It was just like Queer Street meant you're close to getting knocked out.
So
okay, so this is what he's referring to. All right, long-term follow-up of transsexual persons undergoing sexual reassignment. So first of all, transsexual is a dated term. Sorry, I had to look through this study, and I had to be like very specific about the study that he had linked before. All right, these are very dated studies that are very old. They operate based off of our old understanding of gender dysphoria, which was gender identity disorder, which was overly diagnosed on people who just happened to be gay in some capacity in a lot of instances and didn't actually have a deep amount of distress associated with their gender and their sex not aligning. That's going to be one pretty big factor. This is from 1973 to 2003. It's a pretty big factor in the actual validity of these statistics. Overall, it seems like suicidality didn't change based on these statistics, which are already out of context. However, quality of life does seem to go up like slightly. To me, this is just a massive misunderstanding of gender dysphoria. This isn't something that you could really operate on or utilize to suggest that there isn't a fluctuation. You can't really use this statistic to invalidate trans people because this is basing it off of people who were grossly misdiagnosed and treated anyway. Whereas, like for a lot of these people, it's very doubtful that they even needed sexual. At the time, it was classified as sexual reassignment surgery because they didn't have gender dysphoria. They were just gay, and they decided to give them these surgeries under bad doctor recommendation. So these statistics aren't really. These are very inaccurate statistics. We need updated ones for sure. If your argument is, hey, they got it wrong in the past, what's saying that they're not getting it wrong now? Fair enough. I think that's a perfectly reasonable perspective to have. It's not enough to make any broad assertion on, and yet Crowder is making these broad assertions, even though he's like very much wrong. He's basing this off of studies that are at least 20 years old.
But queer ended up being used as a derogatory term towards LGBTQ plus people, which is because, of course, words, of course, have their trajectory in history, their usage. It happens a lot with a bunch of different terms. But now a lot of LGBTQ plus people, that's what the Q is in LGBTQ, right, is queer.
Well, not always. Some people say it's questioning.
Some people do say it's questioning. I see it as queer. It's just very... But the Q is used, queer is very much, especially in the community, is used as an umbrella term, just to encompass people that perhaps wouldn't want to identify as anything else, don't prefer other labels.
So you're not lesbian. Does queer mean that you're not bisexual, but you're not lesbian?
No,
Does queer mean, what does queer mean then? Because again, I would be like, okay, bisexual, lesbian, I understand.
I think very much like the whole gender identity thing. I think it's just kind of how you personally identify. I use queer just because I don't feel as though anything else truly encompasses me as a person.
Do you mean, you can always tell me if they're too invasive, do you mean as far as your orientation or your gender or both?
Typically my orientation.
Okay. So are you trying both men and women?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So how is that? So again, it would seem to me that
how's that?
That would fit.
Have you been with both men and women? Yeah. How is that? Are you asking for personal reasons, Crowder?
Bisexual.
I don't feel 100% comfortable talking 100% about it, or especially just like on camera. But so typically
fair,
people that
yeah.
are bisexual experience. And again, you probably are going to hear this and be like, I don't know.
That's okay.
Which is why I think it's wonderful to explain a little bit more,
Sure.
especially if people.
I'm genuinely curious because I've had different people give me different definitions of queer. Yeah.
Yes.
Who cares? That's what I say. It's fucking, who gives a shit? Some of the labels get a little annoying. Queer is whatever. I just don't care. Gay, straight. This is all I care about. Gay, straight. That's it. Gay, straight, trans. I don't even think we need lesbian. You're a gay girl. You know what I mean? Like we're getting a little too complex for some of this shit. Like, all right, so I don't have to agree with everything. You're gay, or you're straight, or you're trans. Okay, that's it. It's straight isn't even in there. So instead of LGBTQ, it should be Dragon Ball GT. That's what it should be. Gay, trans. That's all you need, bro. That's all you really need.
So, like I said, queer is very much used as an umbrella term for a lot of different people, and I like that label a lot just because it's not ultra specific, because again, it's just an umbrella term, and it's not like I'm picking and choosing at things just because I'm not a huge fan of labels, because I realized that a lot of people put you in a box with labels.
Right.
If you identify sometimes as something, they
Usually you got to put labels on a box before you ship them.
just view you very much with stereotypes, and I'm not a huge fan of that. And but bisexual people are those that are attracted to and I know you're going to hear this and you're going to be like, what do you mean, or more. Typically bisexual people, the definition within the community, and which is more widely accepted, is those that are attracted to two or more genders.
Right.
So
I thought it just meant two, because bi would mean two.
yeah, which is why I was like, you'll probably hear this and be like, what in the world?
That's why they go with, what is it, poly? No, not poly. What's the other one now? Fucking pansexual? It's getting a little complicated, bro. But okay.
Because it would make sense to me if bisexual means you're attracted to male,
To two,
female,
yes,
and queer means two or more. That would make more sense. But I have heard this where bisexual doesn't mean two. I'm like, well, why have the bi?
Yeah, I completely. That is very hard for people to grasp, but it's very much.
Well, yeah, because it's a changing system, right? I mean, bisexual existed before trans people were really valid, were considered valid. I just feel like, who gives a fuck? You're bisexual, you'd fuck whatever. Like, that's what I look at. All the labels are, you're gay. This is it, guys. You're gay or you're trans. That's it. That's what we're doing now. We're simplifying it.
Two genders, or very much two or more genders, and which is, again, that whole concept goes with there are only two genders, because especially underneath like things such as bisexual, or even labels such as pansexual, which is not often talked about.
Yeah.
It is.
Thank
I
God.
understand it.
It's not often talked about. We got to talk about it less, guys.
Pansexual means that you can be queer in orientation and gender fluid yourself as well.
Pansexual means that you are.
Oh, don't worry about it. It's fine.
I'm so sorry.
That's totally no problem.
Pansexual means that you are attracted to people regardless of gender. That is how I've always heard it, and I have people that identify as that, and that's very much how they feel.
And how is that different from queer?
From queer, like I said, queer is very.
Oh, he's sitting close because like they can't hear each other. Because Crowder, even though he's been doing this for years, hasn't figured out a way to do this correctly.
Very much an umbrella term, so it encompasses.
So pansexual could go under queer?
Yes.
Okay.
Very
Sounds
much so,
complicated.
yes.
Okay. So then why is there LGBT? Sometimes they include a P even after the Q.
Not typically. Typically it is LGBTQIA+.
So I've seen LGBTQ AIP at a feminist film festival, and I've seen even AAIP, but I have quite commonly seen AIP.
I've never seen it with P, but
So P should go under Q.
I'm not saying it should go under Q,
It can.
because it can if that person identifies with that.
But Q couldn't go under P.
Q. I mean,
Because Q
again,
would be
it's
the umbrella
whatever you want. Like I said, Q can be used as an umbrella term, or it can be used as its own separate thing.
Yeah. Well, look, here's the thing. I'm not going to agree with the changing of the acronym as long as, unlike the Canadian government, you don't compel me to use that language.
Yeah.
Like, whatever you say you are, I'll say, okay, fine. But I'm probably not going to keep adding LGBTQAIP or allow someone to say.
Which is why typically I just say LGBTQ.
Okay.
It's very simple.
It seems like, but then at that point, then it just seems like if Q is the umbrella term, just say Q. Because LGBT could all fit under Q.
Well, I mean, again, people very much identify with those labels. There were previous labels that I used that I stopped using because I didn't feel comfortable, because a lot of, especially with lesbian, the term lesbian, it has a historical history behind it, and I don't want to, not necessarily offend, but I just don't feel comfortable using it.
Plaid shirts and buzz cuts?
No, that's very much a stereotype.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It became a stereotype, and then I noticed a lot of women are like, well, I'm a lesbian, but I'm not. I mean, I have a lesbian who I work with who was like, I'm a lesbian, but I'm not that kind of lesbian. So she says Q, even though she's not bisexual. She's a lesbian, but she will say, I'm not a stereotypical lesbian.
Well, I mean, lesbians can come in all shapes and sizes, all forms. You don't have to be...
But this lesbian is aggravated by it.
Okay, then...
And she drives a Subaru, and she goes, by the way, it's a coincidence I got a good deal. It's not because I'm a lesbian. And actually, we have a lot of fun with it, where she goes, I get the stereotype. And I think that always... Look, like I said, I'm going to disagree with the acronym, the language, the fundamental changing of it.
We're going to disagree on many things.
But I have to tell you, I've enjoyed the conversation. And hopefully, what I just ask, hopefully that people can do is when we leave this conversation, understand we come from different perspectives.
Absolutely.
But I think
Yeah, I understand that, except you were just very misrepresentative of everything you say. That's the problem with Crowder. It's not what he believes. It's the way that he believes it, in the sense of just constantly pushing out of context statistics and trying to railroad the person he's talking to and talking as fast as possible. And his main goal really seemed, to me, it just seems like he's doing his best to try to embarrass the person while trying to seem like he's a nice guy. And so I think it's very dishonest and shitty.
I think yours comes from empathy, and even if people might think mine is not, it comes from wanting different solutions and empathy. Conservatives, there's this misinterpretation that if they disagree, it must be intolerant or hateful.
Well, no, it's the fact that you are pushing statistics that are very out of context and dishonest. That's what makes you come off as intolerant, because you're intentionally pushing bullshit statistics to try to seem like just to be invalidating. Like, you're not observing the statistic and then going, this is the problem. Crowder isn't observing his statistic and going like, oh, let me use this statistic in context, excuse me, to formulate my opinion. What he's doing is he has an opinion about trans people, and he's finding a statistic and saying, oh, let me use this statistic, no matter how correct it is, or out of context it is, and let me use it to still promote my ideology. That's why this is the problem. That's the problem.
It's not. It's just, it's rooted in not only a very different worldview, but I would argue like there's a lot of data to reflect we're going down a very dangerous path with like children transition.
Yeah, show me the data, because you haven't shared any like good information yet. But okay.
And unfortunately, you're seeing here today, people get shouted down, and that's something we have to.
According to the data, that I don't really understand how to extrapolate.
Get past, even if I was baby Hitler, which I'm not. I'm just saying that we need to be able to have these conversations, and I really appreciate you doing. You know what I think a big part of that is probably because, kind of like me, I was raised as a conservative Christian in a very, very left, very left. And not only that, I'm not Catholic. I went to public schools, which were all Catholic when I was being raised. So I was forced to understand their perspective and sort of forged in the fire. And the same thing with you on the flip side. If you were raised in the Bible Belt, Christian conservatives, you've probably had to argue your position.
Oh, absolutely. Which is why earlier you mentioned the conservatives are seen as intolerant. A majority of my life, I've seen conservatives as...
I know. Oh, there was a spider. Oh, geez.
Don't worry.
I'm very intolerant of spiders. I don't like them.
It just fully crawled on me.
Oh, God.
It's fine. It's okay.
No, it's not fine. I'm going to kill it after.
Gotta find it.
Okay, I will.
But I grew up seeing conservatives as very intolerant, and it was just because the conservative people that I had in my life were very intolerant in the sense of they're not open to conversation. Yeah. Which is why today, whenever I see people walking by and just being like, oh, blah, 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 I'm just like, you either one should ignore it. Ignore it, or adding fuel to the fire isn't that great. It's just there's no, if you can't have a conversation about it, nothing's gonna get done.
But you're a classical liberal in that sense, because even though we disagree, you can sit down, express your point of view, and some people on the left view that in and of itself as adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
And I would argue adding fuel to the fire is simply trying to eliminate voices from the conversation. By the way,
that or just being completely polarizing and just being like, you suck.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't think that's taking place here.
Yeah. So.
I'm sorry. Your name again was.
Gabriella.
Gabriella. I was like Gabriella. I will remember. I'm horrible with names. I'll never forget your face.
No, it's okay.
Gabriella. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. This was wonderful. Thank you. I wish that all my conversations could be like this, but unfortunately they're not.
Yeah, and again, we don't 100%.
Wait, what the fuck is the microphone for? He put it down and the audio didn't change. What's the point of the microphone in the first place?
Agree on everything, but it's still.
Why the fuck did they need the microphone? Is it a prop?
It's cool to have conversations.
No, yeah, and I would defend your right to say anything you have to say to the death, regardless of how much I disagree with it. So thank you, Gabrielle. And I know this has been a long time. Do you have big Halloween plans?
I'm gonna go to my room. My roommate left for the day. I think I have to take care of her dog.
Don't watch Barbarian.
All right.
My dad was talking about it. He said it sucks. Is it?
I don't care about the rest of this conversation, honestly. Okay, interesting. Always nice to watch a terrible dog shit fucking Crowder video.
I want Papa Gut to pee on my face, but just as a friend. There's nothing weird about that. I want him to pee on my face.